The air hung heavy in the Clarendon County Courthouse. It carried the weight of injustice. It smelled of fear and desperation. A small figure sat dwarfed in the oversized chair. George Stinney Jr, a 14-year-old boy, clutched a Bible, his knuckles white. His eyes darted around the room, searching for a friendly face, a glimmer of hope. There was none. In just a few short weeks, this courtroom, with its wooden benches and stained glass windows, had become his whole world. Soon it would lead him to a fate more cruel, more final than any child should ever face: the electric chair. George Stinney Jr.'s story is a harrowing reminder of the power of prejudice and the fragility of justice. It is a story etched in the annals of American history, a stark testament to the systemic racism that has haunted this nation for centuries. His trial, conviction, and execution for a crime he did not commit remain a chilling testament to the darkest chapters of America's past, a past we must confront, lest we are doomed to repeat it. It was 1944. Jim Crow laws controlled the South. George Stinney Jr., a black teenager, was accused of killing 2 white girls. The trial was unfair from the start. An all-white jury was quickly chosen. The defense lawyers did very little to defend George. No physical evidence connected George to the crime. The courtroom was just for show. The judge showed clear bias. George was interrogated without his parents or a lawyer present. The entire process was steeped in racial prejudice. Let's take a pause and go back in time to Alcolu, Carolina. The year is 1944. The small town of Alcolu, South Carolina, was filled with fear and suspicion. People whispered in the streets, spreading fear and prejudice. The victims, Betty June Binnicker, 11, and Mary Emma Thames, 7, were white. Their deaths deeply affected the community. The town's attention turned to George. This encounter was quickly turned into an accusation. No physical evidence connected George to the crime scene. Despite the lack of evidence, fear and prejudice took over. From his arrest to his execution, only 83 days went by. 83 days to prove he was innocent, 83 days to fight a system that was against him. It was a race against time that George couldn't win. He was questioned without his parents or a lawyer. His confession forced out of him was the only evidence they had. The trial was unfair. It lasted just 2 hours. The jury took only 10 minutes to decide he was guilty. They didn't suggest any mercy. The judge, influenced by the laws and racial prejudice of the time, sentenced George to death. George was then taken to Columbia, South Carolina, to wait for his execution. He was kept alone in a cell with only the guards for company, who felt both sorry for him and looked down on him. The Bible his mother gave him didn't bring much comfort in such an unfair situation. On June 16, 1944, George Stinney Jr. was taken to the execution chamber. He was just 5 feet 1 inch tall and weighed only 95 pounds, too small for the electric chair. They had to use books as a booster seat. The face mask was too big for him and slipped down, making him suffer the full force of the electric current. His death was quick but very painful. George Stinney Jr.'s case was forgotten, just another sad story from the Jim Crow era. But in 2014, 70 years later, his case was reopened. A judge found serious mistakes in the original trial and lack of evidence and cleared George's name. This decision, although too late for George and his family, highlighted the ongoing issue of racial prejudice in the justice system. The exoneration, though very late, brought some hope. It started a national conversation about racial bias in the criminal justice system, a conversation that still matters today. I bet you didn't know that Stephen King's book, The Green Mile, was inspired by cases like George Stinney Jr.'s. George Stinney Jr.'s case wasn't the only one like this. It's a clear example of a repeated issue in American history. Many black men and boys have been wrongly accused, convicted, and even executed. The Jim Crow era had a big impact on the South. It made it common for black people to be seen as guilty without proof. George's trial showed the deep racism in American society. From segregated schools to all-white juries, the message was clear. Black lives were not valued. This history of racism still affects the American justice system today. George Stinney Jr.'s story reminds us that justice is something we must always fight for. This fight needs our full attention and commitment. We must remember the wrongs that led to his unfair conviction and execution. We should honor him by working for a fairer society for everyone. His case shows that the fight for racial justice is not over. The racism that caused George's death is still present today, seen in racial profiling, mass incarceration, and economic gaps between black and white Americans. We must remember George Stinney Jr. We must remember his story. And we must use his story to keep fighting for justice. The fight for a world where every child, no matter their skin color, can live a full life. A world where justice is a right for everyone. A world where what happened to George Stinney Jr. never happens again.